Hi, I'm Ann Gaviola. Welcome to the Peak on Global, where we break down what is trending in the business world and what you need to know to stay ahead of the curve. Joining me now is Brett Chang from the Peak podcast. Welcome, Brett.
Hey, Ann, great to be with you.
Brett, let us talk about Taylor Swift snubbing Canada. So her Eras Tour is circling the globe. She just added 14 stops, but still 0 in this country, to the point where Justin Trudeau tweeted at her, asking her to come to Canada. What gives?
Well, there's a lot of theories behind this, and it is unusual. If you look at her tour, she's going truly all around the world, whether it's in the US or Europe and Asia and Australia. And so there's a few theories. One of them is that the stadiums in Canada, they're just not big enough for her to bring the show here and be able to make money off of it. It's too much of an exercise to move all the staff around. So that's one. If you look at the average attendance of her shows in the US, they're usually held at big NFL football stadiums that can accommodate for around 70,000 people. This isn't true everywhere, but it is true in the US. And so that could be one consideration. The other is the Canadian dollar. It just might not make sense for her to move everyone up and all the equipment and sell tickets here when she could have many of those fans come to border towns in the US to go see the show. But it is really strange. Most major artists do stop by here, and it's odd for her not to.
Absolutely. And I mean, there are a lot of theories floating about, from the fact that it costs her and her team a ton of money to maybe bring in all their merch and all the things that they need for their concerts into Canada. And that stadium theory, I mean, this isn't the first time that I've heard about it, but she is, playing 3 nights in Warsaw, Poland, for example. And surely, I don't know, I think Toronto, Vancouver, and Edmonton and Montreal, I could go on and on. Surely we have something here for her, but that is, we'll just leave that on pause for a minute, because if I think too deeply about it, I just go down the rabbit hole. Now, this first story is a business story. It isn't all about, this moment in pop culture history, which definitely, I will agree, Ms. Swift is very much having. Now, full disclosure, I'm not a huge Swiftie. In fact, I think she is lyrically super gifted, and she's an incredible performer, but she's perhaps somewhat overrated. There are other tremendously talented artists out there, and they're getting way less attention. But I do deeply acknowledge she is an economic powerhouse to contend with. So the amount of money generated by this tour is staggering. Apparently, it's enough to move the needle on GDP and inflation in some small and not so small countries. This is a big deal.
Yeah, it's absolutely a big deal. I for one, I feel like I've grown up with Taylor Swift. We're about the same age, and I've been listening to her ever since I was in high school. And so she is a big part of my life. And I think what's most incredible about her is the staying power, that she's been able to stay so relevant and so popular for so long. And she makes a lot of hits. And that's probably what's the most important part of her career. But yes, we saw Swedish economists, they noted that part of the reason why inflation went up in the country was because of the Beyonce tour. It's a small enough country, and it was a big enough show that there was enough economic activity that would increase the price of things like hotels and food. And so there is definitely a big impact that can be had from these types of mega concerts in smaller markets.
Yeah, I think that's called the Beyonce bump, what you're referring to. Let's move on to our second topic. And I do wonder if it would be more effective for a prime minister to ask Taylor to come to Canada, maybe on Threads instead of Twitter. Now, Threads is, of course, Meta's answer to Twitter. According to Mark Zuckerberg, 10 million people joined this social media platform in the first 7 hours. I've spent a little bit of time on there. It is interesting. I know the Peak team is on Threads. Are you joining, or have you joined? And what do you think of the timing of the release of this app? It's fascinating because Twitter has been floundering, and that's putting it nicely during the Elon Musk era.
Yeah, I'm excited for Threads. On Saturday, it was the first day of free agency in the NHL, and it was the day that I wanted Twitter to be working the most, and it wasn't. It was rate limited. You could only see so many tweets. You wouldn't be able to search things. You couldn't find people's profiles and see what they had recently tweeted. It was a very frustrating experience. So Threads now launching only, just under a week after that event is very interesting. And if you go on the app, what you'll first notice is that it's actually not much different from Twitter. It feels, it looks, and operates like Twitter does, except it's just got a bit of a slicker interface, and it feels a bit more like a beta version. There's not the full feature set that you would expect from Twitter. But I think it's exciting and interesting, and I am on Threads, and it's working so well. It's working well for me so far.
And most importantly, at least this has been my experience, I find Threads to be significantly less toxic than Twitter can sometimes get. So the question of, is Threads a Twitter killer? I mean, it depends on who you ask, but all the analysts that I spoke with do raise concerns about user privacy. So by signing on to this, you're agreeing to share very sensitive info, everything from like your browser history, fitness, financial data, and respecting privacy, being responsible and fair with user data, well, that's just not been Meta's strong suit, as evidenced by a whole bunch of examples, including the Cambridge Analytica fiasco. However, I'm also told that it's pretty much par for the course, as in you're giving up as much as you would to like TikTok, maybe Twitter and other social media apps. Are you at all concerned about the privacy aspect of this, Brett?
The short answer is no. I think you're exactly right that it's the same amount of information that you would give up to any social media app. And so if you're concerned about that, you basically make a decision that you're going to remove yourself from social media entirely. You can't be on Instagram, you can't be on Facebook, you can't be on TikTok or Twitter or whatever social media app du jour there is. And so, yeah, I think overall I'm not particularly concerned about it. And I think that it'll just be interesting to see if Threads can actually usurp Twitter as the go-to text-based social media app.
Yeah, hindsight is always 20/20, and I will say I wish I had chosen a different Instagram handle because you kind of poured it over when you go over to Threads, but that's for another discussion entirely. Our third story also involves Meta. This is a company that is playing hardball when it comes to the dissemination of news in Canada, and I'm talking about the battle over the Online News Act. So in response to Meta's decision to block news content on its platforms, and I've noticed this already on Instagram, the federal government is suspending all of its ads on Facebook and Instagram. Interestingly, though, Google, which has also threatened to block news on its platform, seems more willing to negotiate with Ottawa. What do you think of all this, Brett?
So C-18 is obviously a particularly contentious piece of legislation. I think that the challenge that publishers and the government have found themselves is they didn't actually take the threats of Google and Meta seriously. But as the legislation has been passed and is now in the process of developing regulations, it is looking increasingly like they will actually follow through on this. Now, publishers are deciding whether or not it's worth the risk of taking the money that they should be able to receive from these platforms, but also not have the opportunity to distribute their content on the normal channels like search and Facebook and Instagram. And so everyone's trying to figure out what the actual outcome of this legislation will be. The important point, though, is that while the legislation has been passed, it's now in regulation development. So the CRTC is working through what the actual rules around the legislation might be. I think this is the opportunity that Google is looking for in particular. Can you now work with the CRTC to develop a set of regulations around this piece of legislation that would be less impactful than it is currently written? So that's what we're going to have to keep an eye on. Google seems to be playing fair with the government to try and revise these regulations and put them and develop them in a favorable way. Whether or not that actually happens is something that we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, and I'm on board with the thrust, the raison d'etre for this legislation, this regulation. I do worry a lot about the collateral damage of all of this. And any way you slice it, every equation I've looked at, it seems like it's the media companies that are going to be paying a really big price, both short-term, medium-term, long-term, and the rest of it. So thanks so much, as always, for your time and your insight, Brett.
Thanks, Anne.
And you can get all your daily business news with the Peak Daily Podcast. It is available for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts.